Wes Craven, arguably one of the modern-day godfathers of horror, once said, "Horror films don't create fear, they release it." Since 1896, when Georges Méliès screened The House of the Devil, fans of films have been enjoying the thrill of being scared. They cringe at the gore, peek through the shadows, and scream for their lives, but why do they keep coming back for more? Hi, I'm Kaelais Beaumier, digital cinematography student at Full Sail University. Follow me down the rabbit hole as we travel through the decades looking over the history of horror films. I hope you survive the journey. The horror genre started at the end of the 1800s with The House of the Devil, but the genre itself would not take off until after World War I, when German Expressionism found its way onto the silver screen. The films of this time built off of the stories that made the genre in the first place, and the works of Poe, Stoker, and James would set the stage to toy with audiences' deepest fears. Silent films were no strangers to the horror genre, and by the mid-1900s, the first monster movie found its place in film history. The Golem, and later Nosferatu, would use different techniques to try and thrill their audience. The Great Depression ended, talkies replaced silent films, and America was trying to recover. The introduction of sound would not only change the landscape of film, it would advance the horror genre altogether. Audiences wanted to escape the everyday, and they would do this by going to the cinema. They would break away from their world and into the world of the supernatural. In 1931's Frankenstein, Dracula, and 1941's Wolfman used fantastical supernatural creatures to help people find their escape. If the creatures of the 1930s and 40s were considered fantastical, the 1950s paved the way for a new type. The creature feature was introduced in films such as The Creature from the Black Lagoon, Them, and Tarantula would introduce the world to a new breed of monster, the mutant. Where the previous eras were all about the audience escaping, the 1960s were about turning inward and reflecting on what was happening during this time. Audiences craved films that reflected more reality, turned social constructs upside down, and were more sophisticated. Films such as Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho and The Birds used the normalcy of Norman Bates and the mystery of a girl gone bad as reflections of that time. By the end of the era, films like Night of the Living Dead, which used camp horror, and Rosemary's Baby, which introduced us to the idea of evil spawn, would bridge the genre into a new era. Psychology took center stage during the 1970s. With an era filled with grim feelings and societal trouble, horror films rose to the occasion, ready to scare up a good time. The family unit, especially children, was the focus of horror films during this time. Carrie, The Exorcist, The Omen, and Halloween all exploited this innocence for a good thrill. Other films, such as The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Hills Have Eyes, and Last House on the Left, also exploited the family unit, but in a darker, more tortuous way. Psychopaths led the way during the 90s, but it would be Wes Craven who would come full circle and break the rules.
Ever played Skin the Cat?
Wes Craven's New Nightmare brought Freddy back to life, and in 1996 he introduced us to Ghostface in the film Scream.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie.
While the genre has gone through a number of various changes, the most recent haunts are of those we cannot see. The Blair Witch Project at the end of the 90s set the stage for found footage, and films like Paranormal Activity and Final Destination would pit our heroes against a non-corporeal villain. So remember, the next time you sit down to watch your favorite horror film, check in the closet, under your bed, and
whatever you do, don't fall asleep.